I found out my family was planning to erase me from my own life on Thanksgiving morning, while the turkey was still defrosting in the sink and the house smelled like sage and betrayal. I was standing at the top of the stairs barefoot listening. I should not have been awake at 6:43 in the morning. At 62, sleep had become fragile, the kind that breaks if a pipe rattles or a memory slips in sideways. I had gone downstairs for water, still wrapped in my robe, when I heard my name spoken the way people say it when they think you are already gone. "She won't last another year," my daughter said. Calm, practical, like she was discussing an expired carton of milk. My son laughed quietly. "Mom's stubborn, but once the papers are signed, it won't matter." Papers. I leaned against the wall because my knees gave out before my heart did. They were in the kitchen. My kitchen. The one I remodeled with my late husband after 30 years of saving and arguing over paint colors. The one where I taught them both how to crack eggs and wipe counters and say thank you. "She trusts us," my daughter continued. "She signs whatever you put in front of her, especially if you say it's about the will." My son lowered his voice. "The lawyer said once we have medical authority, we can move her out of state. Arizona is cheaper." "Move me. Out of state. Like a piece of furniture." My name is Eleanor Price. I was born in 1961. I raised 2 children alone after my husband died of a stroke at 58. I worked for 40 years in human resources at a manufacturing company in Ohio. I balanced budgets, settled disputes, saved for retirement, and paid off my house 2 summers ago. And that morning my children were discussing how to remove me from it. I pressed my palm to my mouth to keep from making a sound. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears, a low, rushing roar. Part of me wanted to burst into the kitchen, demand answers, throw plates, scream. Another part, older and quieter, whispered something that would change everything. "Listen first." I stayed there for 7 minutes. 7 minutes that peeled the skin off my understanding of who my children had become. They talked about selling my house, about liquidating my retirement account, about a revised will I supposedly asked for after the incident, an incident I had no memory of because it never happened. "She's not all there anymore," my daughter said. "The lawyer agrees." Which lawyer, I wondered. Because the one I hired after my husband died would never say that. He was thorough, ethical, expensive, and very clear about my mental capacity. When they finally left for the grocery store, laughing about forgetting the cranberry sauce, I went back to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Shock does strange things. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just drains the color out of the room and leaves you sitting very still, counting breaths. By 9 o'clock, I had made a decision. I was not going to confront them. I was going to outlive them in every way that mattered. That afternoon, while my daughter basted the turkey and my son argued with his wife on the phone, I excused myself and went to the study. I opened the locked file cabinet I hadn't touched in years. Inside were documents my husband insisted we organize after his stroke scare. Deeds, accounts, insurance, copies of old emails, notes written in his careful handwriting, and something else. A manila envelope labeled simply, "If anything ever feels wrong." I sat on the floor and opened it. Inside was a letter from my husband written 2 months before he died. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means I was right to worry. Trust your instincts. Do not trust blood over behavior. Everything important is documented. And remember this, you are not weak just because you are kind." I pressed the letter to my chest and cried silently, the way women my age learn to do when there is no one safe to hear them. Dinner that night was perfect. Laughter, compliments, toasts to family. I smiled. I passed the potatoes. I played the role they expected. But inside, something had shifted. This was not just betrayal. This was war. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. The first rule of revenge is patience, and patience is something you learn only after you have lost enough to know haste will kill you. I spent the next 3 weeks pretending to be exactly who my children believed I was becoming. Forgetful, grateful, slightly confused. It was easier than I expected. When my daughter corrected me, I apologized. When my son offered to handle things, I thanked him. I let them interrupt me, finish my sentences, explain my own life back to me like I was a child who needed pictures. Inside, I watched, I listened, I collected. At night, when the house was quiet, I pulled out my notebooks and wrote everything down. Dates, names, snippets of conversation. The way my daughter avoided eye contact when money came up. The way my son flinched when I mentioned my lawyer. I also made phone calls. The first was to my lawyer, Thomas Reed. 70 years old, sharp as a blade. I did not tell him everything. I asked one careful question. Thomas, I said if someone wanted to change my will without my consent, how would they try? He was quiet for a moment. They would try to establish diminished capacity, he said slowly, usually through a cooperative physician or falsified evaluations. My stomach tightened. And if my children were involved, then I would advise you to document everything and trust no one they recommend. Good. The second call was to my old company. Human resources never really leaves you. You just stop being paid for it. I asked for a favor from a former colleague, a woman I once helped through a brutal divorce. She now worked in corporate compliance. I need a background check, I told her, quietly. On whom, she asked. My daughter's husband, I said. There was a pause. That sounds serious. It is. The report came back 2 days later. There it was. Lawsuit settlements, financial discrepancies, a previous termination for ethical violations that had been buried under a non-disclosure agreement. My son-in-law was not just careless with money. He was dangerous. Suddenly, pieces fell into place. The sudden interest in my accounts, the urgency, the way my daughter kept pushing new paperwork across the table, always just routine. One evening, she handed me a folder after dinner. Mom, this is just a medical authorization, she said, in case of emergencies. I took it. I adjusted my glasses. I let my hand shake. Oh dear, I murmured. So many pages. She smiled tightly. You don't have to read it. I'll explain. I signed. Not my real signature. I learned that trick decades ago during an internal fraud investigation. Same name, different slant, legally distinct. She didn't notice. That night I scanned the document. Power of attorney. Broad, permanent. If it had been valid, it would have given her control over my finances, my healthcare, my residence. I slept very little. By Christmas, they were confident, relaxed, careless. They spoke freely in front of me now. She's declining fast, my daughter told my sister on the phone, loud enough for me to hear. We're doing our best. My sister didn't argue. That hurt more than I expected. But pain like pressure can turn coal into something sharper. On New Year's Day, I did something I hadn't done since my husband died. I dressed up, not for them. For me, I drove myself to Thomas Reed's office and laid everything on the table. Every document, every note, every recording I had quietly started making once I realized the truth. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back and exhaled slowly. They underestimated you, he said. Yes, I replied, and I intend to return the favor. He smiled then just slightly. Good, he said, because what they've done isn't just immoral, it's illegal. Outside, the January air burned my lungs, but I welcomed it. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt something other than grief. I felt clarity. And somewhere deep inside, beneath 62 years of sacrifice and silence, a colder emotion began to take shape. It wasn't anger, it was resolve. By February, my children believed they were winning. That was the most dangerous part. People reveal their true selves when they think the ending is guaranteed. They rush, they brag, they stop checking their work, and most importantly, they stop seeing you as a threat. My daughter began leaving documents out on the kitchen counter. My son started taking phone calls in the living room instead of the garage. They spoke about after everything is settled like it was a vacation already booked. I let them. Meanwhile, I began my second life. Every morning after they left for work, I drove across town to a modest brick building with a faded sign that read, Elder Advocacy and Legal Aid. I had volunteered there years ago after my husband's death, helping other women navigate paperwork and benefits. I walked back in as if no time had passed. I need help, I told the director, a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair and kind eyes, but I also need discretion. She listened, she always did. By the end of the week, I had a team. Not an army. I didn't need one. Just the right people. A forensic accountant, a geriatric psychologist with an unblemished reputation, and a young attorney who had built her career dismantling cases of elder abuse. They did not treat me like a fragile woman losing her grip. They treated me like a client. That mattered more than I can explain. The accountant found discrepancies in my son's handling of my expenses, charges I never made, transfers I never approved, small amounts at first spread out hoping I wouldn't notice. Hope is a powerful drug for thieves. The psychologist evaluated me over 3 sessions. She tested memory, reasoning, attention. When she handed me the report, she smiled. Eleanor, she said, you're sharper than most people half your age. I tucked that paper into my folder like a weapon. At home, the performance continued. One evening, my daughter sat across from me with her lips pressed together, the way she did when she was about to say something rehearsed. "Mom," she said gently, "we've been talking. The house might be too much for you." I looked up from my tea. Too much. So many stairs, maintenance, it's not safe. Where would I go? She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Her grip was firm, possessive. "There's a lovely assisted living community near us. You'd have friends, activities." I smiled faintly. "And my things? We'll take care of everything." "Of course you will," I thought. "I suppose you're right," I said aloud. "I get tired these days." Her relief was immediate, almost obscene. That night, I cried in the shower where the sound of water could hide the sobs. Not because of what they were doing, but because of how easily they justified it to themselves. 2 days later, the trap snapped into its first position. A certified letter arrived addressed to me. Inside was a notice from a bank I had never used referencing a meeting scheduled in my name to discuss asset restructuring. My daughter intercepted it. I watched from the hallway as she opened the envelope, her brow furrowing. "What's this?" she asked, holding it up. I squinted. "I don't know. Did I schedule something?" Her eyes flicked to my face, searching for something. Confusion, fear, weakness. She found what she wanted. That afternoon, she made a phone call she didn't realize was being recorded. "We need to move faster," she said. "If there are other accounts, we can't risk her remembering." Remembering. That word echoed in my head long after she hung up. I went to bed early that night, heart-pounding, mind-racing. They were accelerating, which meant I had to be ready for impact. The meeting at the bank was set for a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray winter day that makes everything feel heavier than it is. I insisted on attending. "I should be there," I told my son at breakfast. "It's my money, isn't it?" He hesitated just long enough to tell me everything. "Of course," he said, "we'll go together." The conference room smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. A man in a navy suit greeted us with a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He introduced himself as a financial advisor recommended by my daughter's husband. Recommended. That was my first confirmation. As he spoke, outlining options and percentages, I watched my children instead of him. My daughter nodded along, already imagining the future. My son avoided my gaze, his jaw tight. "And with this authorization," the advisor said, sliding a document toward me, "we can streamline everything." I picked it up. It was nearly identical to the forged power of attorney my daughter had already tried to slip past me. Different letterhead. Same intent. My hands trembled, real this time. "Oh," I whispered, "this is a lot." The advisor leaned forward. "You don't need to understand all of it, Mrs. Price. Your children are here to help." I looked at my son. "You agree with this?" He swallowed. "It's for your protection, Mom." Protection. I nodded slowly and signed. Again, not my real signature. The moment we left the bank, my daughter exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for months. "That went well," she said. "See, everything's under control." That night, I made one final call. To the district attorney's office. Elder financial abuse is not taken lightly when it's documented properly. When it involves forged signatures, manipulated medical claims, and coordinated deception, it becomes something else entirely. A case. The investigator assigned to me listened quietly as I explained. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush. At the end, he said one sentence. "We've been waiting for someone like you to come forward." That was when I knew. This was bigger than my family. This was about every woman who had ever been told she was too old to notice, too tired to fight, too kind to push back. The following Sunday, my daughter announced a family dinner. She invited my sister, my nephew, neighbors I barely spoke to anymore. A public stage. They wanted witnesses. I agreed, smiling softly. As I set the table that afternoon, my hands were steady. My heart was not. I knew what was coming. I also knew something they didn't. The house was still mine. My mind was still sharp. And the documents they thought would bury me were about to become the evidence that destroyed them. When the doorbell rang and the first guests arrived, I took my seat at the head of the table and folded my hands in my lap. Let them perform, I thought. The curtain was about to rise. Thanksgiving had taught me how quietly cruelty could wear a smile. This family dinner taught me something else. How eagerly people believe the lie that comforts them. The dining room filled slowly. My sister arrived first. Perfume, two strong eyes darting as if she already knew she was standing on unstable ground. Then my nephew and his wife, polite and distracted. Two neighbors I barely spoke to anymore. My daughter had chosen them carefully. Respectable, observant, useful. David poured wine. My daughter fluttered from chair to chair, checking plates, smoothing napkins, playing the devoted caretaker. If anyone had walked in cold, they would have seen a perfect family gathered around an aging matriarch. What they would not see was the plan humming beneath the surface like a live wire. Dinner progressed with forced cheer, stories repeated, laughter arriving half a beat too late. I ate little. I watched everything. Halfway through the main course, my daughter stood and tapped her glass. The sound sliced through the room. "I just want to thank everyone for coming," she said, smiling tightly. "We wanted to have this dinner because, well, there are some changes coming." I lowered my eyes just as we had practiced. My sister leaned forward. "What kind of changes?" My daughter placed a hand on my shoulder. Her palm was warm, possessive. "Mom has been struggling lately," she said gently, "more than she lets on." A murmur rippled through the table. I felt it then, the old instinct to defend myself, to explain, to reassure. I buried it. "She's forgetting things," my daughter continued. "Appointments, conversations. She even got confused at the bank recently." That was a lie, a clean one, designed to sound reasonable. My son cleared his throat. "We've been working with doctors," he said. He would not look at me. "Doctors. Plural." My sister gasped softly. "Oh, Eleanor." I lifted my head slowly. I let my eyes drift unfocused. I let my hands tremble just enough to be noticed. "I don't like when people talk about me like I'm not here," I said quietly. The room stilled. My daughter squeezed my shoulder harder. "See what I mean?" That was the moment the room shifted. Donna, my neighbor from across the street, frowned. "Eleanor seems fine to me." My daughter smiled, patient and condescending. "That's common. Moments of clarity." Moments. I felt something cold settle into my chest. Not fear, not sadness. Anger sharpened into purpose. My sister reached for my hand. "What are the doctors saying?" My daughter inhaled, preparing for the final act. "That Mom needs full-time care, and to afford the best place we'll need to sell the house." Silence crashed down like broken glass. Sell the house. The house my husband built with his hands. The house I paid off with decades of careful sacrifice. I stared at the table, then up at my son. "Is that what you think?" I asked softly. He swallowed. "It's for your safety." Safety again. I nodded slowly. "If that's what you think is best." Relief flooded my daughter's face. "Too soon." Donna pushed back her chair. "I'm sorry, but this feels wrong. Eleanor is sharp. I talk to her every morning." My daughter's eyes hardened for just a fraction of a second. "You don't see what we see." I stood then, slowly, deliberately. My husband used to say I began that truth does not rush, lies do. They all looked at me. "I trust my children," I continued, voice trembling just enough. "If they say this is necessary, then I suppose it is." My daughter exhaled, but I added, lifting my gaze, "I would like everything in writing." Her smile faltered. "Every evaluation, every document, every signature." The room went quiet. My daughter laughed lightly. "Of course, Mom." But I saw it then. Fear. The following week unfolded like a chessboard, tipping slowly toward checkmate. My daughter delivered documents every other day. Medical evaluations from doctors I had never met. Financial summaries that skimmed too quickly over the details. A proposed sale agreement for my home already drafted. She spoke faster now, smiled less. "People do that when they sense control slipping." I signed nothing. I delayed. I asked questions. "Can you explain this part again? What does this word mean? Why does that date not match the other one?" Each question irritated her more than the last. My son grew quieter. His silence was louder than any argument. On Friday afternoon, my sister called. "I'm worried about you," she said. "I know," I replied. "You don't sound confused." I closed my eyes. "That's because I'm not." There was a pause, a long one. "They say you are," she said carefully. "They say many things." She sighed. "They showed me documents." "So will I said, "soon." That night I barely slept. Saturday morning I dressed carefully. Neutral colors, comfortable shoes. I placed a small recorder in my pocket and drove to Thomas Reed's office. The district attorney was already there. A woman in her early 40s, sharp eyes, calm voice. She shook my hand firmly. "Mrs. Price," she said, "you've done exactly what we needed." Thomas slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of everything. Forged signatures, conflicting medical reports, evidence of financial transfers, the background report on my son-in-law. And one more thing, a recording. My daughter's voice crisp and irritated. "She doesn't need to understand it, she just needs to sign." I closed my eyes. The district attorney leaned forward. "We're ready to move when you are." When I asked, "Whenever they try to finalize." They did not make us wait long. Sunday evening, my daughter announced we had an appointment Monday morning. The lawyer, the final paperwork. She said it like a victory lap. I nodded. All right. That night, I sat alone in my bedroom and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to mourn the family I thought I had. Then I stood, squared my shoulders, and prepared for war. Monday morning, we walked into the lawyer's office together. My daughter, my son, me. The papers were laid out neatly, the pens placed just so. Mrs. Price, the lawyer, said smoothly, "We'll just need your signature here." I picked up the pen and set it down. "I have something I'd like to add," I said. My daughter stiffened. "Mom, we talked about this." "Yes," I said calmly, "and now it's my turn." The door opened. The district attorney stepped inside. Then another officer. Then another. The air changed instantly. "What is this?" my daughter demanded, standing. "An investigation," the district attorney replied, "into elder financial abuse." My son's face drained of color. My daughter laughed shrill. "This is a misunderstanding." I stood. "No," I said. "This is the truth." The lawyer backed away from the table. The officer reached for his cuffs. And my daughter finally looked at me, not as a burden, not as an obstacle, but as something else entirely. A threat? Chaos has a sound. It is not shouting, not exactly. It is the scraping of chairs, the sharp intake of breath, the way a room suddenly fills with too much air and no one knows where to put it. My daughter was the first to recover. "This is outrageous," she said, voice high and brittle. "My mother is confused. This is harassment." The district attorney did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Mrs. Harris," she said, reading my daughter's married name off the folder. "We have recordings, forged documents, and sworn evaluations contradicting the ones you provided. Please sit down." My son did not sit. He backed away from the table like it might bite him. "Mom," he said, panic finally breaking through his calm. "What is this?" I looked at him, really looked. The boy who once cried when I left him at kindergarten. The teenager who begged me not to sell his first car. The man now standing in front of me, hands shaking, eyes darting for exits. "This," I said quietly, "is what happens when you mistake my silence for weakness." The officer stepped forward. "Mrs. Harris," he said, "you are being detained pending further investigation." Detained. The word landed like a slap. My daughter's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in months, she looked small. "You can't do this," she said, turning to the lawyer. "Tell them they can't." The lawyer did not meet her eyes. "I advised you against proceeding without independent counsel for your mother," he said. "You chose to ignore that." The handcuffs clicked closed. That sound followed me for weeks afterward. My son sank into the chair, head in his hands. "Mom," he whispered, "I didn't know it would go this far." I stepped closer to him. "You knew enough." They escorted my daughter out first. She twisted around, eyes blazing. "You planned this," she spat. I nodded once. "You forced me to." The hallway outside the office was crowded. Someone had tipped off the local press. Cameras flashed. A reporter shouted a question about elder abuse. I walked past them with my head high. For the first time in months, my spine felt straight again. The investigation moved quickly. Too quickly for my son. By Tuesday afternoon, his accounts were frozen. By Wednesday, his employer placed him on administrative leave pending review of ethical concerns. By Friday, his wife had taken the children and moved in with her sister. He came to my house that night. He did not knock. He stood on the porch like a stranger, shoulders slumped, eyes red. "I never meant to hurt you," he said when I opened the door. "Intent does not erase impact," I replied. "They were just papers," he said desperately. "We were just trying to manage things." "Manage me," I corrected. He looked past me into the house. "You don't understand how much pressure there was." I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "No," I said. "You don't understand how much strength it took not to confront you the day I heard you planning my removal." His breath hitched. "You heard that." "I heard everything." He sank onto the porch step, a grown man unraveling in front of me. "They told me you were slipping," he said, "that you'd thank us later." I crossed my arms. "And did you ever ask yourself why I never sounded like that when we were alone?" He did not answer. Inside, my phone buzzed. "The district attorney." "They're cooperating," she said, "both of them, blaming each other." I closed my eyes. "Mrs. Price," she continued, "there's something else." My stomach tightened. "What?" "We found evidence of financial misconduct going back several years, not just against you." I opened my eyes and stared at the darkened street. "How bad?" She hesitated. "Bad enough that this won't end with a quiet settlement." I hung up and looked at my son. "This isn't over," I said. He nodded, tears sliding down his face. "I know, betrayal has layers. You think you have reached the bottom, and then the ground gives way again." 2 weeks after my daughter's arrest, the district attorney asked me to come in. Her office was quieter this time. No small talk, no coffee. She slid a folder across the table. "We traced some of the transfers," she said. "They didn't all go where you thought." I opened the folder. Inside were bank statements tied to an LLC I did not recognize. Shell accounts, offshore links. My hands went cold. "This isn't just greed," I said. "No," she replied, "it's organized." The name on the LLC stopped my breath. My sister, or rather her married name. I stared at it, willing it to change. She helped coordinate, the district attorney continued. Introductions, recommendations. She was paid. Paid. My sister who held my hand at my husband's funeral, who borrowed my dresses, who called me her rock. I drove to her house that afternoon. She knew why I was there. She opened the door and immediately started crying. "I didn't think they'd hurt you," she sobbed. "They said you'd be comfortable, that it was just paperwork." I laughed, a short, sharp sound that surprised us both. "That's what everyone says," I replied, as if cruelty becomes kinder when it's quiet. She tried to touch my arm. I stepped back. "How much?" I asked. She hesitated. "How much did you sell me for?" 30, she whispered. 30,000. I nodded slowly. "Was it worth it?" She collapsed onto the couch. "They promised I wouldn't have to worry anymore," she said. I was tired of struggling. I felt something inside me break free. Not anger, release. "You don't get to be tired at the cost of my life," I said. I left her house without another word. That night alone in my bedroom, I allowed myself to feel everything I had been postponing. The grief, the humiliation, the loss of the family I thought I had earned through decades of loyalty. And then something else, a strange, steady calm. Because clarity is a gift even when it arrives wrapped in pain. The next morning I called the district attorney. "I want to proceed," I said, "with everything." There was no hesitation in her voice. "We're ready." By spring, the case was public. Headlines used words like betrayal, exploitation, manipulation. Neighbors stopped me in the street to apologize for not seeing it sooner. I thanked them and kept walking. The house was quiet now, too quiet. But it was mine. I began making changes, not renovations, reclamations. I took down photographs that made me ache and replaced them with landscapes I loved. I turned my son's old room into a study. I planted a new tree in the backyard, something that would outlive me. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old boxes, I found a journal from my 40s. Pages filled with reminders to be patient, to be understanding, to keep the peace. I closed it. Peace built on silence is not peace. It is surrender. As summer approached, the district attorney called again. "We're setting a court date," she said. "Are you ready to testify?" I looked around my home, at the sunlight on the walls, at the space where fear used to live. "Yes," I said, "I am." Because whatever happened next, one truth was already clear. They had tried to erase me. Instead, they had reminded me exactly who I was. The courtroom smelled like old wood, disinfectant, and nerves. I arrived early, as I always had for every important meeting of my life. Waiting had never scared me. What scared me was being unprepared, and I was prepared in ways my children still could not imagine. They brought my daughter in first. She looked smaller without her tailored coats and confident stride. Her hair was pulled back too tightly, her eyes ringed with sleepless nights. When she saw me, something flickered across her face. Not remorse, calculation. My son entered next. He would not look at me. His shoulders were hunched, his confidence drained, as if it had leaked out through the weeks of interrogations and frozen accounts. My sister sat behind them, not with family, but with her attorney. That was when the final illusion died. We were no longer blood bound by love. We were individuals bound by consequence. When the judge entered, the room rose. I felt my pulse steady. 40 years in corporate conference rooms had taught me how to hold myself when power sat across the table. This was no different. The prosecutor spoke first, calm, methodical. Every word landed exactly where it was meant to. She laid out the timeline, the medical manipulation, the forged documents, the financial transfers disguised as care, the coordination between family members. Then she called me. Walking to the witness stand felt like crossing a bridge I had been building my entire life without realizing it. I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth. The whole truth had been waiting a long time. I spoke slowly. Clearly, I did not cry. I described the Thanksgiving morning when I first overheard the plan. I described the documents slid across the table with smiles attached. I described the way my intelligence was questioned, my autonomy eroded, my voice dismissed. When the defense attorney asked if I might have misunderstood conversations due to stress or age, I looked directly at him. I ran a human resources department for 4 decades, I said. I have terminated employees for less sophisticated deception than this. A ripple moved through the room. I described the moment I realized my kindness had been weaponized, the moment I chose strategy over confrontation, the moment I stopped trying to be a good mother and started being a living one. Then the recordings were played. My daughter's voice echoed through the courtroom. She doesn't need to understand it, she just needs to sign. My son closed his eyes. My sister stared at the floor. The judge's expression did not change, but something hardened behind his eyes. The defense tried to argue intent, confusion, concern, love gone wrong. The prosecutor stood. This is not misguided caregiving, she said. This is systematic erasure of a competent adult for financial gain. When court adjourned for the day, my daughter finally looked at me. Not with anger, with fear. That night I slept deeply for the first time in months. Because once the truth is spoken aloud, it cannot be shoved back into silence. Sentencing took place 6 weeks later. By then the story had spread. Elder advocacy groups attended. Reporters filled the back rows. People I did not know nodded at me, as if I were something more than a woman who had survived her own family. I was not interested in being a symbol. I wanted an ending. The judge spoke for a long time, about trust, about vulnerability, about the particular cruelty of betrayal when it comes from those sworn to protect. My daughter was sentenced first. Years in state prison, mandatory restitution, permanent removal of authority over vulnerable adults. She did not cry. She stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, still refusing to see herself as anything other than unlucky. My sister's sentence followed. Shorter, community service, fines, a lifetime fracture she would never fully repair. Then my son. He stood when his name was called, hands shaking. The judge looked at him for a long moment. You did not initiate this scheme, he said, but you enabled it. You benefited from it, and you did not stop it. My son nodded, tears finally spilling. The sentence was less severe than my daughter's, but it carried weight. Probation, restitution, court-ordered therapy. When the judge asked if I wished to speak, the room stilled. I stood. I do not wish for vengeance, I said. I wish for accountability. I turned slightly, not to look at them, but to speak the truth they needed to hear. I was not betrayed because I was weak, I said. I was betrayed because I trusted. Trust is not a flaw. The judge nodded. The gavel fell. It was over. Outside, cameras waited. Questions hung in the air. I walked past them all. At home, I unlocked my door and stood in the quiet. No voices speaking for me. No hands guiding my pen. Just space. I brewed tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened my husband's old letter again and read the line I had memorized by heart. Do not trust blood over behavior. That spring, I changed my will. Not out of spite, out of clarity. I funded a legal aid scholarship for women over 50. I set aside money for myself to travel to live without apologizing for taking up space. I learned how to sit with loneliness without letting it harden me. Some nights grief still visited. It sat beside me like an old acquaintance. I let it stay as long as it needed. But fear never came back. They had tried to erase me quietly. Instead, they taught me something I wish I had learned earlier. That survival is not the same as living. And living sometimes requires standing alone in a courtroom and saying without apology, I am still here. After the sentencing, people expected closure. They assumed justice worked like a door you close behind you, a clean ending that lets you walk forward unburdened. That belief belongs to those who have never had to testify against their own blood. What came next was quieter, slower, harder to explain. The house felt different after the trial. Not emptier exactly, but honest. No tension humming in the walls. No careful listening for footsteps or voices. Silence, yes, but the kind that breathes. I spent the first weeks doing very little. I slept late. I cooked meals only when I was hungry. I sat on the back porch with a blanket around my shoulders and watched the new trees sway in the wind. Healing did not arrive as relief. It arrived as fatigue. One afternoon, my son called. I did not answer. He left a message. His voice was small, stripped of the authority he once carried so easily. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. I just wanted you to know I'm starting therapy. The court ordered it, but I think I needed it anyway. I listened to the message twice. Then I deleted it. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. Forgiveness, I was learning, is not an obligation. It is a choice you make only after you stop bleeding. Letters came next, from my sister, from my daughter's attorney, from distant relatives who had heard pieces of the story and felt compelled to offer opinions wrapped in concern. I read none of them. Instead, I focused on building a life that did not orbit around the damage. I enrolled in a writing class at the community college. I volunteered once a week with an organization that helped older women untangle financial messes created by controlling spouses or manipulative children. I spoke only when invited. I listened more than I talked. There was power in being believed without having to prove myself. One day, a woman in her late 70s took my hand after a session. "They tried to take everything from me," she whispered. "I thought I was crazy until today." I squeezed her hand back. "You weren't," I said. "You were surrounded by people who benefited from you doubting yourself." That night, I understood something important. What happened to me was never just about inheritance or control. It was about erasure, about deciding that a woman past a certain age becomes less visible, less credible, less entitled to her own autonomy. I was done participating in that lie. Late in the summer, I traveled alone for the first time in decades, a small coastal town, a rented room with white curtains and the sound of waves at night. I walked the shoreline every morning, my feet in cold water, my mind finally quiet. I thought about my husband, about the life we built, about the children we raised with the best tools we had at the time. I did not romanticize it. Love can exist alongside failure, both can be true. When I returned home, I donated the clothes I had worn when I was trying to look harmless. I kept the ones that made me feel solid, seen. The woman who came back from that trip was not the same one who overheard her children planning her removal. She stood straighter. She spoke less, but with intention. She no longer explained herself. On my 63rd birthday, I woke up alone and smiled. Not the polite smile I had practiced for years, but the kind that rises naturally when your body understands you are safe. I made coffee and drank it slowly. I read. I took a long walk through my neighborhood past houses that had once felt like silent judges and now felt like witnesses. That afternoon, I sat at my desk and opened a new document. I titled it simply "What I Know Now." I wrote until my hand cramped. I wrote about how injustice often arrives wearing familiarity, how betrayal rarely looks dramatic at first, how women are trained to doubt their instincts long before anyone needs to convince them. I wrote about the difference between aging and disappearing. I did not write about revenge, because what I had built was not revenge, it was alignment. Later that day, I received a single envelope, no return address. Inside was a short note written in a hand I recognized immediately. "I am serving my sentence. I think about you every day. I don't ask for forgiveness. I only hope someday you can live without thinking of me at all." I folded the note and placed it in a drawer. Perhaps one day I would open it again. Perhaps not. That evening, I cooked a small dinner and set one place at the table. I lit a candle, not in mourning but in acknowledgement of myself. I raised my glass. To the woman who listened, I said aloud, to the woman who waited, to the woman who survived. Outside, the new tree rustled in the breeze. I did not rebuild my life to prove anything to anyone who hurt me. I rebuilt it because I was still here. Because being over 50 is not an ending, it is a reckoning. If this story touched something in you, if you have ever felt dismissed, manipulated, or quietly pushed aside by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to know this. You are not imagining it. You are not too old. You are not powerless. If you believe in stories where truth catches up, where patience becomes strength, and where justice arrives not with chaos but with clarity, like this story, share it with someone who needs it and subscribe for more stories like this. And if you are watching this and wondering whether to stay silent or stand your ground, tell me in the comments. Your story matters too.